Right now, you are surrounded by countless radio waves. You can't see them, you can't hear them or feel them, but they are bouncing around and vibrating all around you. Every time you turn the radio on, you're actually doing something quite amazing. Whatever station your dial is set to, that's the particular radio wave you're picking up. There are countless other signals being sent in that moment, but you are tuned directly into the one you want to hear. Hello, friends. Peace and love to you today on this Easter week. Our story that we're going to look at today is one in Luke's Gospel about two people that got a firsthand lesson in how to tune their hearts to connect to Jesus. Let's read it together. Now, on that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all these things that had happened. While they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself came near and went with them, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to them, "What are you discussing with each other while you walk along?" They stood still, looking sad. This first section tells us in verse 13 right off the bat that this is later on the day of the first Easter, the resurrection day, when Mary and some of the other women go to the tomb, find it empty, and are told by the angels that Jesus is indeed risen. So later that afternoon, these two disciples are walking from Jerusalem to Emmaus, a small village about 7 miles away. We're told later in the story that Cleopas is the name of one of these disciples. We don't know who the other person was, possibly his wife, perhaps a friend. But either way, we know Cleopas and his partner, who are both disciples of Jesus, are walking to Emmaus from Jerusalem on that first Easter afternoon. And Jesus casually strolls up to them, but they are kept from recognizing Jesus. And he asks them, kind of curiously, "What is it that you're talking about?" He could see that they were engaged in pretty deep discussion. And when he asked them that, verse 17 says that they stood still, they stopped their walking, and they had this downcast look on their face. So let's look at verses 18 through 27 together. Then one of them, whose name was Cleopas, answered him, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have taken place in these days?" He asked them, "What things?" They replied, "The things about Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and leaders handed him over to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all this, it is now the third day since these things took place. Moreover, some women of our group astounded us. They were at the tomb early this morning, and when they did not find his body there, they came back and told us that they had indeed seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see him." Then he said to them, "Oh, how foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have declared. Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and then enter into his glory?" Then, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them the things about himself in all the scriptures. So Jesus asked Cleopas and his partner, "What is it that you were talking about as you were walking on the road?" And they had this strange mixture of emotions. There's grief and there's confusion mixed with hope, but this feeling of not knowing what the future would hold for them. And so Cleopas tells Jesus, who he doesn't know is Jesus yet, "We saw this man who was crucified do amazing things. We believed in him. We were disciples of his. And yet the chief priests and the religious leaders had him crucified just 3 days ago." And remember last week we talked about the Pharisees, how they had growing jealousy toward Jesus and were instrumental in his arrest and crucifixion. And then Cleopas says to Jesus, "We had hoped that he was the promised Messiah that would redeem Israel." And then He goes on to say, we've heard rumors of his resurrection. Some of the women in our group went to his tomb this morning and they found it empty. They said they had this vision of angels that said that he was alive. And it's almost like they want to believe that that's true, but the way he tells it suggests that he hasn't quite bought into that yet. And Jesus' response to Cleopas is, oh, how foolish you are and how slow of heart you are to believe. And oftentimes, when we see Jesus scold the disciples, or in this case, Cleopas and his friend, for their lack of faith, for their doubting, when Jesus says to the disciples, oh, you have little faith, we often read that as Jesus speaking with tremendous anger and almost a sense of punishment in his voice. But really, the biblical Greek, conveys more of a language and a stance of pity, that Jesus almost pities them like children for not believing and not being farther along spiritually than they are. So Jesus is saying here, oh, you're like a little child if only you understood a little more and believed. And then Jesus goes on to explain how it was necessary for the Messiah to come and to suffer and die for the sins of humanity, just as the prophets foretold. And so, beginning with Abraham way back in the Old Testament, Jesus progresses through the scriptures to kind of open their eyes to the grand story of what God is doing through the Messiah. And that leads us to our final section today, verses 28 through 35. So let's read it together. As they came near the village to which they were going, he walked ahead as if he were going on. But they urged him strongly, saying, stay with us, because it is almost evening and the day is now nearly over. So he went in to stay with them. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to them. Then their eyes were opened and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. They said to each other, were not our hearts burning within us while he was talking to us on the road, while he was opening the scriptures to us? That same hour they got up and returned to Jerusalem, and they found the 11 and their companions gathered together. They were saying, the Lord has risen indeed, and he has appeared to Simon. Then they told what had happened on the road, and how he had been made known to them in the breaking of the bread. So Cleopas and his friend and Jesus, whom they think is just this kind stranger who knows a lot about the scriptures, reach Emmaus. And Jesus acts as if he's going to continue walking down the road. So Cleopas and his friend say, please, it's almost evening. Come and stay with us tonight. Jesus accepts their invitation, goes to their home, and they get settled in and they sit down at the table for dinner. And Jesus takes the bread and he blesses it and he breaks it to divide it among them. So reminiscent of the Last Supper that Jesus had with his disciples just days earlier, the night before his crucifixion. And it's in that moment, verse 31 tells us that their eyes were opened and they recognized that it was Jesus. At that moment, their spiritual radio dials were finally tuned in, and what was previously static was now clear as a bell. Here was Jesus, the Son of God, who had been crucified just 3 days ago, sitting before them, alive and well. Can you just imagine the emotions that flooded into their minds and into their hearts? I imagine they were speechless and in shock at seeing Jesus and having those doubts washed away and those hopes confirmed by seeing him alive. When they recognize that it's Jesus, he vanishes from sight. And I imagine Cleopas and his friend, their eyes are wide, their hearts are racing, and they tell each other, weren't our hearts burning within us as he walked with us on the road and as he talked with us? Didn't we sense something unique and amazing about this man? And they are so excited that even though it's dark, they get up from the table and they go back to Jerusalem. Remember, it's 7 miles away, and they probably ran most of the way out of excitement. Back to Jerusalem to the 11 disciples who are gathered together, and they tell them with joy that it is indeed true that Christ is risen. Isn't it interesting how Cleopas and his friend were with Jesus for quite some time before they recognized that it was him? Although they sensed something special, they said that their hearts were burning with excitement inside of them. They weren't quite tuned in to Jesus' frequency. But after walking with him and listening to him and sitting down to dinner with him, finally they found the right wavelength and got a good connection. And they saw and they heard and they experienced Jesus loud and clear. In another post resurrection story in Matthew 28, the last words that Jesus shares with his disciples before ascending into heaven is, I am with you always to the very end of the age. As Christians, we believe that Jesus is alive and well and active in our world today. We believe that God the Father, Jesus the Son, and His Holy Spirit are always working and moving around us and through us. Just as Jesus was walking with Cleopas and his friend that day, Jesus is always with us too. And just like Cleopas and his friend, it's possible for Jesus to be right beside us and we not know it. How? Because our hearts may not be tuned in to his frequency. Just like the radio waves in the air, Jesus' presence can't always be seen or heard or felt. I believe that sometimes he can. But like your favorite radio station, he is always available. We just have to push the power button and tune in. Being at home for this extended period of time is a perfect opportunity to form the habit of tuning our hearts daily to Christ's presence. Things like praying, talking with and listening to Jesus, reading our Bibles, meditating and reflecting and worshiping, going outside and paying attention to creation. These are all some of the most effective ways that we can adjust the dials of our hearts and tune into the presence of Jesus around us and among us. And when we do, like Cleopas and his friend on the road to Emmaus that day, we will find that our hearts are burning with excitement when we recognize that indeed Christ is risen and he is with us in a very real way. So may we take time today and every day to turn down the noise of the world around us and tune the dials of our souls to pick up the frequency of Jesus' love and his peace and his presence.